Some women don't destroy a man's pride. They simply reflect it. Silently. Patiently. Until the reflection becomes unbearable to look at. He called her distant, mysterious, hard to read. But what he was really saying was, she didn't feed his illusion. She didn't bend her warmth around his wounds. She didn't kneel before his unhealed boyhood pretending it was love. And so, he mistook her silence for rejection, when in truth, it was revelation. She became the mirror that revealed the cracks in his armor. Not the woman who bruised his ego, but the one who showed him it was already broken. He met her in a season of certainty. A man sure of his charm, his dominance, his control. The kind of man who wore confidence like a mask so polished that even he forgot the face beneath it. He didn't fall for her kindness. He fell for her calm. Her stillness was disarming. Her eyes too knowing. When she looked at him, she didn't see his performance. She saw the trembling behind it. And that terrified him more than any rejection ever could. For men like him, validation is oxygen. Their power grows in the presence of praise. They breathe through admiration. They feed on attention. She gave him neither. Not because she didn't care, but because she had learned the cost of care. Given to those who only take. In Jungian terms, he was possessed by his persona. The mask he crafted to survive in a world that rewards appearance over authenticity. But she had outgrown her own mask long ago. She had done her shadow work. She had met her own darkness and walked through it. So when he projected his image of the ideal woman onto her, she didn't play along. She let him see himself in her quiet. She let him experience what it feels like when your reflection doesn't worship you, but questions you. He mistook that for rejection. But it was the beginning of awakening. In the early days, she fascinated him. Her attention felt like sunlight, rare, warm, and deliberate. She listened, but not to his words, to the spaces between them. She saw the patterns, the little contradictions, the way he smiled when he was uncertain, the way he dominated conversations. So he wouldn't have to be seen. He thought she was soft. He thought he could read her. But she was not a page in his story. She was a mirror in his labyrinth. And mirrors don't bend to please the lost. There's something dangerous about a woman who's done her healing. She doesn't argue. She doesn't chase. She doesn't try to fix. She simply holds up a reflection. So honest that the unready call it cruelty. He began to feel it. A subtle discomfort when she looked at him too long, when her silence lingered too deeply. Because the moment she stopped playing along with his ego, he had nowhere to hide from himself. This is the paradox of the feminine mirror. She doesn't reject a man. She reveals him. And revelation, to the unhealed, feels like punishment. In his mind, she was pulling away. In truth, she was standing still. It was he who retreated, because he couldn't stand to see himself through her eyes. He once believed power meant control. Over women, over emotion, over perception. But she taught him, without words, that real power begins in surrender. And yet he wasn't ready. He mistook surrender for weakness. So he fled. Back into the arms of distraction. Back into the noise that drowns out truth. The world told him he lost a good woman. But Jung would have said, he lost an encounter with his own unconscious. He didn't lose her. He lost his reflection. Because she wasn't the fantasy he desired. She was the mirror he needed. There is an archetypal tension between the ego and the mirror. The ego wants to be adored. The mirror wants to be honest. The ego thrives on illusion. The mirror thrives on clarity. And when a woman has reached a certain depth within herself, when she has sat with her own darkness, forgiven her own wounds, and walked through her own fire, she no longer serves illusion. Her love stops being flattery and starts being truth. And that kind of love, to an unhealed man, feels like rejection. She didn't reject him. She reflected him. But the reflection was too much. He saw in her what he refused to see in himself. His fear of inadequacy, his hunger for control, his fragile masculinity disguised as confidence. And so, when she grew silent, it wasn't a punishment. It was mercy. Because the awakened feminine doesn't argue with illusion. She lets it collapse on its own. And collapse it did. One night when the noise faded, he realized her absence wasn't emptiness. It was echo. Echo of his own voice, his own patterns, his own unfinished work. She had become the stillness that haunted him, because in her calm, his chaos had nowhere to hide. And that was the beginning of his unraveling. The point where projection meets truth. The moment when the man realizes the pain he felt in her silence was never about her at all. It was about himself. He tried to move on. He told himself she was forgettable, just another chapter in a book of unfinished stories. But her silence lingered like incense in an empty temple, soft, sacred, and impossible to erase. He didn't understand why her absence echoed louder than her presence ever did. Why every new woman felt like a replica carved from wax, melting under the weight of comparison. Why every conversation felt hollow. Why every touch lacked the spark that once terrified him. It wasn't her beauty he missed. It was her depth. The way her stillness pulled at the edges of his soul, like a gravitational force he couldn't name. He had called her cold once, but now he understood. She wasn't cold. She was contained. She didn't overflow for anyone who couldn't swim. In Jungian language, he was now standing at the edge of his shadow, the part of himself he had buried beneath charm, success, and performance, the part that trembled whenever truth got too close. And her silence, her steady, merciless silence, was the mirror that forced him to look. He began to see the pattern, the same story told through different faces, the same hunger for control, the same fear of being truly known. Every time he met a woman who could see through him, he would retreat, back into validation, back into noise, back into the performance of power. But this time, the performance no longer worked. The applause had grown faint. The masks no longer fit. And the reflection of her quiet truth, had carved something permanent into his psyche. The truth is, some mirrors break you before they heal you. Not out of cruelty, but because the illusion must die before the man can live. Her silence became that death. A slow, dignified undoing of everything false in him. He began to dream of her, not as a lover, but as a symbol. Her eyes like gateways, her voice a whisper of conscience, her touch, memory. It wasn't her he longed for anymore. It was the man he almost became when she saw him clearly. The version of himself he glimpsed in her gaze, before the fear pulled him back. She, meanwhile, had moved deeper into her becoming. The woman who mirrors does not chase. She does not cling to the reflection once it fades. She knows that when a man runs from his own shadow, he is not rejecting her. He is escaping himself. So she doesn't wait. She returns to the sanctuary of her own energy, to the temple of her self-worth, where silence is not absence, but presence. Because when a woman learns to be still within herself, she becomes untouchable, not hard, not cold, but sovereign. In that sovereignty, she remembers what power truly is. Not dominance, not validation, not attention. Power is clarity. Power is knowing you are no longer a reflection for someone else's unfinished work. Power is the ability to walk away, not in anger, but in understanding. He, however, was unraveling. The mask had begun to slip, and for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his own emptiness. Without her gaze to reflect his image, he no longer knew who he was. That's the danger of the unexamined ego. It cannot exist without an audience. And when the mirror goes still, the ego collapses into dust. One night, in the quiet hours between memory and sleep, he saw her again, not in body, but in symbol. A vision of her standing in water, eyes unafraid, holding a mirror made of moonlight. He looked into it, and saw not her face, but his own. Tired, unmasked, human. That was the moment he broke. Not from heartbreak, but from revelation. For Jung, this is the confrontation with the shadow, the sacred disintegration of illusion. It is the point where projection dies, and integration begins. He finally understood. She hadn't rejected him. She had invited him into wholeness. He just wasn't ready to accept the invitation. There's a certain kind of woman who awakens the unconscious in a man. Not through seduction, but through stillness. Not through words, but through presence. She doesn't try to teach. She reveals. And revelation, to the unready, feels like rejection. He mistook her silence for cruelty, her distance for pride. But what she gave him was mercy, the gift of seeing himself without distortion. And that, he now knew, was the most terrifying gift of all. In her absence, he began the work. Not the performative kind, but the slow, quiet excavation of soul. He confronted his own fears of inadequacy, his hunger for approval, his addiction to power. And every time he felt the pull to reach out to her, he remembered the mirror and stayed still. Because to reach for her again, without transformation, would be to repeat the same dream. And dreams, once awakened from, cannot be relived. There comes a moment when the silence stops feeling like punishment. It begins to feel like space. A vast, echoing stillness where everything false burns away. He wandered in that space for months, maybe years, though time had lost its shape. The world outside moved forward, yet something within him was suspended. He had chased the image of himself that she once reflected, but now he was standing in front of the raw, unadorned truth. The man without performance. The man without armor. The man stripped of applause, stripped of fantasy, stripped of the illusion of control. And it was there, in that nakedness, that he began to meet himself for the first time. In Jungian psychology, this is the descent into the underworld of the psyche, the night sea journey. Every man must take it, though most never will. It is the journey where he confronts his shadow, not as an enemy, but as the brother he has long denied. He begins to see how his need to dominate was born from fear, how his charm was a shield, how his arrogance was a trembling prayer for approval. He sees how he used women, not to love, but to feel alive. And in that moment of awareness, her silence begins to make sense. She had not abandoned him. She had withdrawn her energy so he could finally face the emptiness within. Her distance had been a mirror, and in that mirror, he saw not her rejection, but his own self-avoidance. When he finally understood, something inside him softened. He stopped cursing her name in the privacy of his thoughts. He stopped replaying the story in search of a villain. He stopped needing closure from her, because the closure was never hers to give. It was always buried inside him, beneath the rubble of pride and projection. That was the moment his awakening began. She, too, felt the shift, though she was not waiting for it. She had built a quiet life around peace. Not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the solid, rooted peace of alignment. Her mornings were slower now. Her words fewer. She no longer explained her boundaries. She simply embodied them. There was power in her gentleness, the kind that came from knowing she could shatter illusions and still choose compassion. She no longer mirrored. She emanated. She no longer reflected a man's potential back to him. She radiated her own wholeness outward. In that transformation, she became something beyond desire. She became presence. The feminine, when integrated, becomes not chaos nor compliance, but stillness that awakens consciousness. She had walked through her own underworld too, through the heartbreak of being misunderstood, through the exhaustion of being the mirror for others' healing. But she emerged not bitter, not closed, but serene. She understood now. Some souls come not to stay, but to awaken. He was one of them. He had not been her punishment, nor her partner, but her initiation. Meanwhile, he began to dream differently. The same dream that once tormented him, her eyes, her silence, her mirror, now came as a symbol of light. He saw her standing again, this time not as a phantom, but as a guide. She held no mirror, only a lantern, and in its glow he saw something beautiful and terrifying. His own shadow smiling back at him. The ego, once fractured, began to bend toward integration. He no longer feared his flaws. He no longer chased validation. He began to understand love, not as possession, but as awareness. That's the paradox of awakening. The love that once drove you mad becomes the silence that saves you. She had been the catalyst, but never the cure. The medicine was always within him. She had simply shown him where to look. And so, he began to live differently. More aware, more patient, less hungry for power, more open to connection. He began to notice the sacred in the ordinary. The way sunlight fell across his hands, the quiet weight of his breath, the miracle of stillness without needing noise. She would never know how deeply she had changed him. But that was never the point. Transformation rarely announces itself. It simply unfolds. There's a sacred symmetry in human relationships that Jung called the projection of the soul. Every person we meet carries a fragment of our unconscious. We love what we wish to reclaim. We fear what we have disowned. And sometimes, the person who breaks us open is the one who frees us most. He no longer hated the mirror. He began to bow to it, because only through that mirror had he found his true reflection. Not in her eyes, but in his own awakening. For her, life went on, but something subtle had shifted too. She no longer saw men through the lens of potential. She no longer mistook emotional chaos for passion. She no longer felt responsible for healing what she did not break. Her energy had refined into quiet sovereignty, and it was that very calm that made her magnetic. To the unhealed, she would appear distant. To the conscious, she would feel like home. Because that's what happens when a woman stops mirroring and starts being. She becomes a living embodiment of balance. And balance, to the wounded, feels like mystery. In that mystery, he finally understood. She had not rejected him. She had reflected him, until he could see. And when the seeing began, the story ended. Not with a reunion, not with a confession, but with awareness. There comes a time when mirrors are no longer needed. When reflection gives way to recognition. When the ache of longing dissolves. And what's left is not absence, but peace. He no longer looked for her in faces of strangers. He no longer sought redemption through romance. He began to walk through life with the steadiness of a man who had met both his shadow and his soul, and chosen to bow to both. The world hadn't changed, but his eyes had. The noise of desire quieted, and in its place came stillness, a stillness that whispered, "This was never about her. It was always about you." She too had evolved beyond the need to be understood. She no longer lived as the mirror, but as the moon itself, radiant, untouched, reflecting only light. The lessons had etched themselves into her silence. She knew now that not every connection is meant to continue. Some exist only to ignite transformation, to pull both souls out of illusion and back into essence. And essence, unlike love stories, requires no audience. They crossed paths once more, not by plan, but by the subtle choreography of fate. It wasn't a grand reunion. There were no apologies, no confessions, no rehearsed lines. Only two souls standing quietly in the aftermath of their own evolution. He smiled, not the charming smile she once fell for, but a small, real one. The kind born from humility, from having broken enough to soften. She returned the smile. Not out of nostalgia, but from recognition. The kind that says, "I see what you've become, and I honor it." In that silent exchange, time seemed to stop. No words were needed. For the first time, there was nothing to prove, nothing to fix, nothing to want. Just presence. The tension that once burned between them, that electric pull of desire and resistance, had transmuted into quiet understanding. This was the alchemy Jung spoke of, when two opposites dissolve their projections and return to the unity beneath them, not as lovers, but as mirrors that have fulfilled their purpose. He saw now that love was never about possession, but perception. It was about seeing another soul in their wholeness, not as a reflection of your hunger. And she saw that strength was never about holding on, but about knowing when to let the story end in stillness. Because the sacred feminine doesn't conquer. She awakens. She doesn't demand closure. She becomes it. She doesn't destroy the masculine. She invites it to remember itself. In that remembering, something ancient came alive. A harmony older than desire, deeper than time. They both felt it. The quiet pulse of completion. The circle closed. The mirror dissolved. The lesson fulfilled. And in that dissolution, they each returned home. Not to each other, but to themselves. The man who once sought control now understood surrender. He learned that power without presence is emptiness, and that the only mastery worth having is mastery of the self. He no longer feared his vulnerability. He no longer mistook gentleness for weakness. He no longer chased validation in feminine mirrors, because he had finally become whole enough to see his reflection within. The woman who once held mirrors for men no longer needed to. She had transcended the role of muse, healer, and savior. She had become her own mythology. Her beauty was no longer a performance. It was an emanation, the stillness that comes from inner union. She had integrated her shadow and her softness. Her intuition no longer came from pain, but from peace. And that peace made her untouchable, not because she was unreachable, but because she was free. Their story would not end in love, but in liberation. Because true love, the kind born of consciousness, does not cling. It expands. It blesses and releases. It walks away not in anger, but in reverence for what was revealed. That night, beneath a quiet sky, she whispered, not to him, but to the echo of what they once were. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak. She simply sees more. The wind carried those words into the distance. And in that same moment, he felt them, not as loss, but as truth. For he knew now what she had always known, that love is not found in the eyes that need you, but in the soul that mirrors your awakening. And so they walked, separate paths, same light. Two souls who had loved, broken, mirrored, and finally remembered. Her silence remains, not as absence, but as a sacred echo of everything real. The woman who walks away in silence isn't weak, she simply sees more.